Good evening, everybody. It's so good to see you all and to be able to take that mask off. I'm not sure if I'm actually protecting anybody up here, but I'll do my best. I appreciate the introduction, and of course I'm glad to be here. I wish that my wife and my kids were here tonight, but we volunteer with the Crisis Pregnancy Center and with the KIME centers down in the Hampton Roads area, and we have a lady who is giving birth today. So if you all would, keep her in prayer and her family, as all of them have their own particular struggles, and we're just trying to walk with them through life. So I really appreciated that 2 minutes where he talked about what that stop sign, and not just the stop sign, but what the whole post represents. And I think that ties in beautifully with the theme of this Wednesday series, Love One Another. I was really encouraged to see that a series coming from Romans 12 wasn't just, okay, let's figure out your spiritual gift. It was, we have a purpose here. We have something that we're supposed to be doing. God expects something out of us that maybe we don't necessarily see in ourselves. So if you have your Bibles, turn over to Romans chapter 12, and I'll tell you a little bit about my 4 kids. My 4 kids give me the opportunity to learn every single day. They give me the opportunity to learn patience. They give me the opportunity to learn how to answer questions properly. But they also give me the opportunity to teach and to refine the way that I nurture and discipline and help them to grow up into productive members of not just the society as a whole, but within the church. But along with that comes all the little fun things. I get to see them grow. I get to see them change. I get to see all 4 different personalities come out. And I have to adapt the way that I talk to each one of them because they're all so different. And isn't that the way that the church is? We are all so different. And God uses different methods to get to us. He uses different ways to teach us. He uses different things to mold us into who He wants us to be. And here in Romans chapter 12, while there is the aspect of what we should be doing, he says, hey, I've given you all something. I've given you all something that I want you to give to other people. Look with me in Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. He says, I urge you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. We're going to talk about that word service a little bit later because it's going to come up again in Romans chapter 12 and verse 11. But it's a completely different idea that he's talking about. But I think it's important that we just note that he says there's something that you're doing before God. When he talks about the angels over in Revelation chapter 8, and he says that they're serving, or even in Hebrews chapter 1, he says that the angels are serving those who will inherit salvation. He uses this word to talk about people who are there before God and people who are serving as if they were serving at the altar. But when he talks about our service in chapter 12 and verse 11, he's going to put us way down on the totem pole. He's going to lower us. He's going to humble us, but at the same time raise us to our proper place in God's sight. And so as we're looking at how God sees us, it always amazes me here in Romans chapter 12 that he says in verse 11, not lagging behind in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. You know, it's one of those passages where if you're reading all of Romans chapter 12 and you're going through it, it amazes me how much I just breeze past that part because it's just another part in the list. So I appreciate the opportunity to be able to prepare 45 minutes to speak on it because it made me really look at, okay, am I lagging behind in diligence, and what does that mean? When my kids see that, hey, the trash needs to be taken out, maybe they don't see that the trash needs to be taken out. Maybe they see a full trash can that they can pack down even more. Or maybe they see it to where they can just maybe play, what's that game? Is it Jenga? Where they can just kind of stack things up as high as they can go without it all falling down. But as adults, hopefully we see there's something that needs to be done here. There's an action that I need to take so that the person who comes up after me isn't having to stack higher and higher. And I hope that it's not my wife, because she doesn't deserve that. And so as we consider God telling us, hey, can you see what needs to be done? When you look around your community, when you look around even just the four walls of this building, is there something that needs to be done? Or do I see something that can be done and say, I'm really glad that there's somebody else who can take care of that? Am I lagging? Am I slow? Am I lazy in my diligence? And that word diligence, we use it often, but what does it mean? It means speed. It means your hastiness. It means your willingness to go at something with full force as fast as you can, because it's your responsibility. Because God has given you a gift, and whatever that gift may be, whether it's encouragement, whether it's the gift of love, whether it's the gift of teaching or prophecy or service or exhortation or giving or leadership or mercy. Whatever your gift is, God says, how fast can you get to it? What are some things that might slow us down? Those things that we say, you know, I really want to get to this. I really want to show God how much I love Him. I want to show people how much I love them as well. And I want to get to it, but there's this roadblock in front of me. What are some of those roadblocks that we face? Well, right here in Romans, there's a huge roadblock there for the Jews and the Gentiles. As you read through, you begin in chapter 1, and it's very clear that the people there aren't in love with each other. They have these gripes that go back centuries, even millennia, just because, well, these people are, according to the Jews, those Gentiles are dogs. The Gentiles look at the Jews and they say, well, look at those rigid, stiff-necked people. Look back in chapter 11 with me. Chapter 11, I'm going to begin in verse 30, and I don't want to belabor this point too much, but one of the things that can slow us down, and maybe this is the elephant in the room, the elephant in the nation, the elephant in the world, that we try to tiptoe around, but Paul faces it head on here. And I think it goes right along with chapter 12, or else he wouldn't have put it right before chapter 12. Prejudice can slow us down. And it's not just race. It's not just gender prejudice. Maybe it's socioeconomic prejudice. I was listening to a gentleman today, and he was talking about our need to be incarnate. And I shared it on Facebook, so if you want to find me, it's Eric Ramseur, not Chuck, and I'll explain that later. But he was talking about our need to be incarnate. Just how Jesus was in his high place in just as much glory as you can ever imagine and more. And he decided to put all of that off, according to Philippians chapter 2, and to become like one of us. And he was talking about our need to maybe put off some of the things that we've been so comfortable with in order to serve people who aren't like us. And so in Romans chapter 11 and verse 30, he says, "For just as you once were disobedient to God, but now have been shown mercy because of their disobedience," talking about the Jews and the Gentiles, "so these also now have been disobedient, in order that because of the mercy shown to you, they also may now be shown mercy. For God has shut up all in disobedience, that he might show mercy to all." Now to Jews and Gentiles, what does that mean? It means you're all the same. It means you're just as wretched as the next person. It means that you don't have a leg to stand on when it comes to God's righteousness or standing up to God's righteousness, because God has lifted you all up by his own mercy. Which only makes Romans 12 and verse 1 make more sense when he says, "I urge you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. He's putting them both together, saying your prejudices against each other aren't helping you, they're hurting you. But by the mercies of God. And that isn't a generic statement. It's not him just saying, God's given you mercy. He says the mercies, the mercy that was given to the Jews and the Gentiles back in chapter 11 in verse 30 and 31. The mercy that was shown to you was given to you because they were disobedient, and vice versa. So how do I look at the mercy that God has given me? Is it something that as Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, is it something that I'll put, under a bushel? Is it something that I try to hide? Or do I spread it to the whole world? Look at that next phrase in Romans chapter 12 and verse 11. It's not just that we're not slow or lagging behind in our diligence, in our speed, and in our haste. He says, fervent in spirit. Am I on fire for God? Am I just anxiously waiting for the next opportunity to serve my God who served me by giving himself up? When I was listening to the lesson earlier, I was like, man, there's no reason for me to get up because he nailed it. Jesus Christ being hung up by 3 nails. Imagine just that. Just a regular person on that cross. That is heartbreaking. But the Creator, the Sustainer, the one who holds all things together by the word of his power, gave himself up so that I didn't have to be on that cross. What an amazing picture of not just love, but of fervence. He was fervent in his love. He was on fire for God the Father and for us. Now, this isn't a lesson on the book of Hebrews, but it's my favorite book, so I'm going to have to reference it. When the Hebrew writer talks to us about Jesus becoming the high priest, what does that mean for us? And it does tie to this in the sense that when Jesus became the high priest, he gave us somebody who could sympathize, who could empathize, who knew exactly what we were going through. So when we're having trouble with, maybe today I'm just lagging a little bit. Maybe today my speed isn't quite what it needs to be because of health, or maybe I'm just worn down from the week. Jesus says, I understand. Jesus says, I understand exactly what you're going through. You know, my cousin John was beheaded, and I was trying to get out to this place all by myself so that I could pray and just be there with my father. But then everybody was just after me. Everyone needed something from me. People saw that I was feeding others, and they came and they wanted something. And then I look at what Jesus did there in John chapter 6. He saw that he wasn't going to have this time alone, and he said, all right, I've got to be fervent. I've got to be on fire. I've got to move forward. I've got to serve these people. And unfortunately, some people there didn't really want what Jesus was offering. But does that mean that he stopped? No. A lot of times what can slow us down is discouragement from the way that people respond to what we're doing for them or what we're attempting to do for them. I don't know if you all have the same issue out here, but within my own family, there have been times when someone said, hey, I'd really like some advice. I really need some help. And then I say, okay, I'm going to do what I can for you. I'm not a licensed counselor, so I can give you biblical advice. Beyond that, don't sue me. And then I pour my heart out, try to give them all that I have, and then they say, yeah, I've heard that before. I've tried that before. We've done that before, and it didn't work. And then when the next person comes along and they say, hey, I need some help, and I say, you know, I tried to help somebody before, and it didn't work then. I've fallen into that same trap. I've fallen into that same pattern where I end up saying, these people aren't worth my time. And that is the wrong way to look at the time that we've been given here on this earth. If I'm going to be on fire, if I'm going to be fervent, if I'm not going to be slow, if I'm going to be speedy, I don't need to look at this world as black, white, Hispanic, male, female, person worth helping, person not worth helping, person who lives like me, person who doesn't live like me. I need to think about your soul. When I think about your soul, it means that I look past all the things that people look at and subjugate you or even raise you up. Because that's what God did. He thought about your soul and he said, how can I serve you? He gave up his life. And so, how the chapter begins, he tells us, present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice. He says, if you want to have the kind of life that's worth living, live the kind of life that Jesus lived. That was a holy, sacrificial, and a holy sacrificial life. Story time. My very first year of ministry was a complete failure. It was a complete failure in the sense that what the people were expecting, I could not do. But it was a success in the sense that I learned from it. I'm a huge Star Wars fan, and I won't belabor this point either. But there's a quote from the 8th movie, The Last Jedi, where Yoda says, the greatest failure teacher is. And I take that with me and I say, okay, what did I do? What did I do that I could do better today, that I could do better tomorrow, not for my sake, but for somebody else's? What can I learn from my failures, from the failures of others? When you look at Paul in his life, he failed quite a bit. He fell, he stumbled, but he had those people like Barnabas who would say, let me bring you along. Let me show other people that you're not so bad or that you have changed. We need other people who are fervent. We need other people who are on fire, who are on God's side, not just ours, in our lives. And that's what I see in the church here. I had the pleasure of meeting with the elders. Well, I won't say I met with the elders. I met along somebody else who was meeting with the elders. And I saw their love for the church here and for the community here. And it was clear that they didn't want to wait too long before they got the ball rolling on some things. Because they realized that time is not on mankind's side. And so I applaud the elders and Mike here. You all have wonderful people working with you. And I appreciate being able to come here and give this lesson tonight because I know that I'm around people who want what's best, not just for the people within these four walls, but also the people outside. On the subject of prejudice, I was working in Georgia for 5 years, and it was Christmas time, and we were so excited. We were excited because we were working within the schools, and we had families who, not just church members were helping, but we were telling other people in the community, and they were like, how can we get on board? The whole community was together, and we were of one mind. And so I was in the local Shell gas station, and I was speaking with one of the managers there, and he said, hey, I know that you all are taking some families and providing for them for Christmas. And I said, yes. He said, we want to do the same thing. We've been given $2,000 where we can take families and help them. So why don't you make some contacts for us because we don't know people in this area. So I was looking for the church as well as for this Shell gas station, and I called a local charity, and the lady said, yes, we have 4 families who could use help. And so she said, let me call you back and I'll give you the details. I said, all right. And so she called me back and she said, okay, here are the families, here's how many children, here's what they have. And she said, can I just ask one thing? I said, sure. She said, can you make sure that the white families get the most? And I started thinking, why would she say that to me? And I said, what's the purpose? And she said, well, I just would like for them to receive more. I said, well, are there more children in these families? She said, no. And I said, ma'am, you do know that I'm black. And she said, well, I couldn't tell over the phone, and she hung up. Where does charity come in? And where does charity leave us when it comes to people who don't look like us or sound like us or feel like us or think like us? Now, I can give more examples of that, but I'm not going to belabor that point. For the Jews and the Gentiles here in the book of Romans, God tells them much the same thing. Look over just a couple of verses in Romans chapter 12 and verse 16. He says, be of the same mind toward one another. Do not be haughty in mind, but associate with the lowly. Do not be wise in your own estimation. Now again, in this context of the book of Romans, the context of Jews and Gentiles needing to be on the same page and needing to be of the same mind, that's what these instructions are about. He's telling them that you all need to work together. Don't let your differences separate you from each other or from Christ. And so as you read through Romans chapter 12, I hope that you'll look at it not just from the standpoint of, okay, what does this mean to me, but rather, what did it mean to those people, and from that, what does it mean to me? What can I learn from how these people lived? How can I learn from what God has told them? And what God tells them is, don't be slow in your speed towards one another, Jews and Gentiles. He tells them, be fervent, be on fire, be enthusiastic in spirit for one another, Jews and Gentiles. He says, serving the Lord. Now, there's some interesting things going on here with the language, because a lot of times when we read through here, it looks like a lot of imperatives. It looks like a lot of commands, but even here in verse 10 and verse 11, when you read, be devoted to one another in brotherly love, he's really just calling them devoted. He's not telling them to do anything. He says, you are devoted. And if you're not, change that. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love, giving preference to one another in honor. And then he says, not lagging behind. Or he just says, not being slow. He says, that's who you are. You are people who are not slow. And then he says, here's how you're going to not be slow. He says, by being hasty, by thinking of one another and thinking of how you can serve each other. Not just that, but serving the Lord. He says, you're going to not be slow by being on fire, by being enthusiastic in your spirit. And that takes preparation. It doesn't just happen. You don't just wake up one day and say, okay, I'm ready to go. Maybe it takes me calling my brother or my sister late at night and saying, okay, here's maybe what we need to do in order to take care of this situation. I'm on probably 5 different group text messages that are going on throughout the night of people just saying, okay, I need your help with this. And I'm not always the person who answers, because I'm on a different group text message and I'm praying that somebody else will pick up the other one. So how do we stay fervent? How do we stay on fire? How do we make ourselves into the kinds of people that God says, you are my servant? Now, we talked about earlier, he said that you're going to be a servant. You're going to be one of those people who's standing before me, and and like the angels are there with the prayers in Romans chapter 8, you're going to be there at the altar. But in verse 11, when he calls us a servant, he's talking about the most lowly servant that you can think about. He's talking about the slave. He says, you are a slave for the Lord. If I'm going to not be slow, if that's what's going to define me as an adjective, when you say Chuck or Eric Ramseur, this is what defines you, you're not slow. He says you're going to do that by making yourself a slave to God. It's difficult in a world that tells us that we have all of the freedoms, we have all of the rights, and we need to fight for those every single second of the day. To give those up and say, you know, there are people who need, understand me, my privileges in this world, the people who need my advantages in this world more than I need them. That's what service is about. It's about giving up my freedom so that someone else can live a life more free. Let's talk about money. How much time do I have, Mike? Sweet. Let's talk about money. I said earlier that one of my greatest failures was my first year of ministry. And I say that because I was given a $5,000 allotment to where I could do evangelism. And in my first year of ministry, I looked at it and said, okay, this is how I'm going to do ministry. But when I would get into the meetings and we would say, okay, here's my plans. Here's what I want to do. And then when those plans get shut down, you say, okay, well, I can't do evangelism now. That was a failure. But what I learned from that was, I don't need a plan. I don't need this big product. I don't need this huge thing with a data sheet and an Excel spreadsheet in order for me to serve God. I fell into that trap. And then they said, well, you know, we need this money so that it can go back into our building fund because we need our building fund in case something happens. And so I said, okay, well, we have this lady who needs help. This lady who needs to be served. And her car is broken down. She needs about $2,000 to get it fixed. The fix is worth more than her car. And they said, well, we would love to help, but we need this money for our building fund. And it made me think, when God brings me before him on Judgment Day, when Jesus Christ comes back, what is he going to say about my building? Is he going to look at the building and say, you know, that's a beautiful building, but you have someone who's homeless over here. That's a beautiful building, but there are children over here who could have been fed. All because I needed this stipend for my evangelism fund that ended up sitting there. These are things that slow us down. These are things that hold us back, and I'm not, beating anybody down because of funds. The church needs them, yes. But man, what are we using it for? He says, use it for service as we serve the Lord. If you would, we're going to close up here in a second. Turn back to Matthew chapter 6. In Matthew chapter 6, we're going to find a part of our application for the night. Because I don't believe in standing in front of people and saying, okay, here's God's word, and then going to sit down. I need something to do this week. Look back in Matthew chapter 6, and you'll find him talking there to people in Galilee, and he's just enlightening them to not only what the Old Testament scriptures were really trying to say, but he's going to talk to them about their righteousness. And there he talks about 3 acts of righteousness that the people were very used to performing. He talks to them about giving. He talks to them about prayer. He talks to them about fasting. And in each one of those scenarios, it's really about service. It's not about the people who are doing the acts. It's about who they're serving. And so he tells them, don't do these things so that you can be seen by men, or so you can be illuminated by men, so that you can receive the praise of men. But he says, do these things in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And then immediately after that, he talks about storing up for yourselves treasure in heaven. Well, that's what your reward is. So I want to give you all something to do. Something to do with me this week, as I'm in Virginia Beach and you all are up here serving the community. We're going to go back in time a little bit more. Look in Isaiah chapter 58. Isaiah chapter 58, and I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's a lot. But when you have some time to do it, I highly recommend looking through this passage, because it changed the way that I looked at fasting. It changed the way that I looked at my service to the Lord. In Isaiah chapter 58, it says, "Cry loudly, do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet, and declare to my people their transgression, and to the house of God their sins. Yet they seek me day by day and delight to know my ways, as a nation that has done righteousness and has not forsaken the ordinance of their God. They ask me for just decisions. They delight in the nearness of God." Now, a little context. The Israelites are in captivity right now. And so God is speaking from the standpoint of the Israelites, and he says, you all talk to me like you're doing everything right. You talk to me and you ask for just decisions. And then he speaks from the people's perspective again in verse 3. "Why have we fasted and you do not see? Why have we humbled ourselves and you do not notice?" And then God speaks on his own behalf. "Behold, on the day of your fast you find your desire and drive hard all your workers." So it's like me talking to my kids and saying, we're going to rely on God. We're going to trust him to help us. And then I say, it would really help if you would work a lot harder. Instead of me sitting back and praying to God and giving him my attention, I work my children, I work those around me harder. He says, that's what you've been doing, Israelites. He says, "Behold, you fast for contention and strife, and to strike with a wicked fist. You do not fast like you do today, to make your voice heard on high. Is it a fast like this which I choose, a day for a man to humble himself? Is it for bowing one's head like a reed, and for spreading out sackcloth and ashes as a bed?" You all want to be seen. "Will you call this a fast, even an acceptable day to the Lord?" Now I want you all to think about that post with all of those nails in it. In verse 6 he says, "Is this not the fast which I choose, to loosen the bonds of wickedness, to undo the bands of the yoke, and to let the oppressed go free, and break every yoke? Is it not to divide your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into the house? When you see the naked, to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh." Not to hide yourself from your own flesh. That's what the Israelites had been doing. If they didn't glean all of their crops, and if they didn't take them all up, which is one of God's issues with them, that's just one of the things that would have kept them out of captivity. But he says, loosen the bonds, undo the bands, let the oppressed go free, break the yoke, divide your bread with the hungry, bring the homeless poor into the house, cover the naked. That sounds a lot like Matthew chapter 25. He says, "Then your light will break out like the dawn, and your recovery will speedily spring forth, and your righteousness will go before you. The glory of the Lord will be your rear guard." If we want God on our side, if we want God to bless us with will continue blessing us with every spiritual blessing. If we want God to bless us as the Israelites we're asking for, with freedom and with wealth, not just for ourselves, but to serve, then he says you have to serve. You have to be about the people who are around you. You need to be about not just the people who have, but the people who have not. The homeless poor, those who are in bonds, those who are trod upon. And he says, if you do that, the Lord will be your rear guard. What does that mean? It means as we're on our way to the proverbial Canaan's land, as we're on our way to heaven, God is watching our rear. He's watching our backs, and He's making sure that we have what we need so that our communities can grow to become more like Him. As we look past our prejudices, as we look past the money issues and whatever else may slow us down, God says, I'll be your rear guard. And as you read on in chapter 58, He says He will speed you forth, and He'll be like the wind under the wings of eagles. That's what I want the church to be in every single place. So if you'll join me in a fast this week, whatever your health concerns are, be very aware of those. Or maybe you're going to just fast from electronics. Make it an hour, make it 3, make it a whole day, whatever you want to do. But in that time, remember that there is service that God wants from us. He says, break the yoke, feed, cover. Whatever you choose to do, pray about it beforehand, and while you're in the midst of service, be in prayer for the church and for those people, that the next time that it's time to serve, they'll be able to do it as well. Thank you for your time.